Hello, everyone, and welcome to the final session of the AMDA and Energy Catalyst sponsored event, The Decade of the Mini Grid. I'm John Lane. I work for the Carbon Trust. I'm delighted to be hosting this panel on the future of the mini grid market. We have some eminent futurologists on this panel, handpicked to give their opinions on what might happen in the future. And what I'm going to do now is just ask them to introduce themselves one by one, and then we'll move on to some questions for them. So let's start with Joao. Joao, over to you from the African Development Bank. Please come and introduce yourself.
Hi there, everyone, and pleased to be here. I hope everyone is keeping safe. So I'm a division manager for renewable energy at the African Development Bank. Also, one of my hats is the coordination of the Sustainable Energy Fund for Africa, which is a large multi-donor facility meant to catalyze investments in renewables and energy access. And by virtue of that, we've been able to do and spearhead a lot of mini-grid work over the years at the African Development Bank, mostly upstream, but now we're looking into catalytic finance instruments, and it's good to be here and tell you what the future looks like. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joao, for coming. Next up is Emily McAteer, who is the CEO of Odyssey Energy. Emily.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here. As mentioned, I'm CEO of Odyssey. We are an investment and asset management platform for mini grids and other distributed energy projects. We think about data in the sector all day long, and I'm very excited to share my ideas on where we're heading in the future for mini grids. Thanks.
Thanks, Emily. And one thing I forgot to mention, we're also going to do a little poll as we do these introductions. And so I'm asking the team if they can set the poll up now. The poll will apply to attendees. And as we continue with the introductions, you can answer the poll as we go through. So thank you very much. I'm sure it will appear very shortly for you. As we're doing that, perhaps Arnaud is next. Arnaud Henin from Goumir Power Networks, please come on screen and introduce yourself, Arnaud.
Thank you, John. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and take part of this event. I'm Arnaud Henin, so Managing Director of Goumir Power Networks. We are a microgrid developer and advisor focused on the microgrid sector, active in a number of African markets. So we're working in a number of markets, including Congo, Mozambique, Nigeria. And our belief is actually in finding and focusing on sustainable business models for microgrids in order to build and replicate systems across the sector.
Thank you, Arnaud. That's great. And next up is Rosemary Idem, who's joining us from Sustainable Energy for All. Rosemary, over to you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rosemary Idem. I work for Sustainable Energy for All. I'm a senior specialist on the results-based financing team. And I'm also driving the implementation of the Universal Energy Facility, which aims to scale up energy connections across Africa. Glad to be here. Back to you, John.
Thank you, Rosemary. And then last but definitely not least, Sam Doobie. Please introduce yourself from TFE Consulting. Hi, Sam.
Thanks. Hi. Thanks, John. My name's Sam Doobie. I'm a recovering mini-grid developer. Cut my teeth in Kenya, building mini-grids for almost 7 years. Now based in Cape Town, where I head up TFE Africa, the African office of TFE Energy. We do a lot of consulting work in the space, looking at data and trying to innovate business models and different ways of doing things to try and get the industry to scale. Thank you.
Super. Thanks, Sam. I think what we'll do is we'll leave the poll open for a little while, if that's possible. I think it will be. And we'll start with our questions, the questions that I have for the panel, and then we'll look to reflect on the poll results after those questions. And so, first of all, I wanted to ask a question for Joao. Earlier in the day, Jan Tanves from the IFC talked about transaction sizes, and so he was talking about big transaction sizes, and we think that maybe $100 million plus deal sizes are going to be needed if mini grids are going to scale quickly enough to meet sustainable goal 7 of universal access by 2030. So for you, Joao, what conditions will allow for such deals? What do you think needs to be done in order for that kind of deal size to happen? And then when will that start to happen? And after Joao's answered the question or given us his thoughts, Also throw it open to the other panelists to give some further thoughts. So over to you to start with, João.
Thank you. Yeah, I think answering that question is probably a tall order, but I'll try to sort of share my views on it. So yes, it is true that we need, especially if we want to tap the more sort of mainstream financiers and certainly DFIs like ourselves, we need to look into larger deals, at least for the African Development Bank. We cannot get our feet wet in deals below $50 million. That's a sort of like a hard threshold. So we need to be looking at projects above that. And we'd love to be financing more mini-grid projects, but it's just we do not find the right sizes in the right packages. And when I talk about the right packages, I'm talking about primarily project finance, which is the workhorse that we use to finance energy infrastructure. And obviously within the project finance, you're looking at senior debt, you're looking at sort of risks that are properly allocated and mitigated. You look at sort of returns in the sort of the low teens and then commensurate with sort of the broader sort of infrastructure spectrum. So this is normally the sort of the paradigm, and it doesn't really fit with the mini grid model. Having said that, I think there are ways around it, and there are ways of making mini grids not equivalent to mini projects, right? I think we can have mini grids in large projects configurations, and two ways of doing that. One is through national programs and try to aggregate multiple sites and multiple projects, which can then sort of be awarded to 1, 2, 3 developers, obviously depending on the size of the program and the size of the country. And you have an aggregation effect within a certain country. The other way is to look into platforms where you can aggregate assets across various developers into one vehicle, into one platform, and bring that sort of the 50 to 100 million plus sort of investment volume in one sort of a pack. I guess the bottom line really is that we need to think about creating utilities. So that's how investors would approach the sector. They look for utilities, they look for strong balance sheets, they look for a strong asset base, and we really need to sort of nudge the sector in that direction. This aggregation, this pooling of assets, the sort of creation of utilities in the mini-grid space. And then obviously that should then set us on course for the more traditional project finance, where you can mobilize senior debt and you can certainly syndicate to a broad range of commercial investors. But you can also look into sort of asset-backed financing models where you pool assets into with credit guarantees, and then you can try to mobilize local financiers, local banks, local currency financing into the mini grid space. In terms of conditions, I think certainly for scale to look into standardization, right? So it cannot be all bespoke for every country, for every region. There has to be some degree of harmonization across the board. Obviously, there will be some customization per country, but the issues of tariffs, subsidies, technology, regulatory frameworks, quality standards, there has to be some degree of harmony around it. And then obviously there is the issue of financing and risk mitigation. And we certainly need more concessional finance, more catalytic finance in the form of RBF, obviously in the form of guarantees, to really move the market to the next level until we have actually enough transactions and can demonstrate that pure sense, and that may still take a little bit, but I think we can get there. On our side, we're very excited to be launching our African Mini Grid acceleration program, and we're looking at tackling some of these issues of aggregation at national level, aggregation at sort of a Pan-African level, standardization, and catalytic finance. Thank you.
Thank you, Joao. That's a terrific start to this debate on how the future looks. Perhaps I can turn to Emily next, because this idea of aggregation, I think, is really important, of those grids. Emily, obviously, that's what Odyssey is doing. Perhaps you could describe a little bit about Odyssey, and then after that, you could just tell us, what you see as the main challenges, say, for being able to, aggregate financing across, hundreds of mini grids, for example, as in your experience of working in the sector.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, maybe I can talk about Odyssey in that context, since that's the big piece of what we're tackling with our platform. And I'm glad that Jan earlier brought up the need for large transaction sizes, because we're doing some really exciting work with the IFC right now around precisely how do you standardize the transactions process, so that you can put really large amounts of capital. The kind of way to think about the challenge is that if you have $100 million, if you're doing a sort of traditional large scale infrastructure project, that $100 million could go into a single project. But if you're putting $100 million into mini grids, that's something on the order of 500 mini grids. It's a lot of projects. And so you really do need an entirely different paradigm for how you make that investment, right? You cannot go through every single step that you would go through for a single project 500 times. It would make the project completely infeasible. And so what we're trying to do at Odyssey is take the pieces of that process of the transaction lifecycle and standardize as much as we can using data and software, so that you can start to repeat these processes over and over again at an aggregated scale across many hundreds of projects at once. And we really think about it in terms of three major sort of phases of the investment lifecycle that need to be standardized. There's a kind of planning and project preparation stage. Otherwise, you could also think about that as the diligence stage, when you're kind of looking at data of, let's say, 500 projects and making sure that each of those projects are rigorously tested and they're viable projects in themselves, and they're also viable as a portfolio. Then you get into kind of the actual transaction process stage. So how do you even interact with multiple project developers at once to aggregate all of their projects into one single investment? That can be a pretty complicated process. And then the final stage is, let's say you've made the investment. How do you make sure that you understand how your investment is doing, and that you're learning from that investment, so that it becomes easier when you go back to the next transaction and start that process again. And so what the platform is doing, what Odyssey platform is doing, is really trying to standardize each of those phases, both in terms of the way data is analyzed and in the way interactions between the stakeholders happen. So in the planning phase, we are working towards standardized KPIs for understanding, what are the key technical and financial parameters of every project. Obviously, there's always nuance that goes into assessing a mini grid project, but can we start to standardize how loads are forecasted, how we think about system sizing, how we assess the financial viability of a project, so that we can start to benchmark hundreds of projects against each other. Then when we get into the kind of transaction processes, this is where we're really focused on kind of the workflows between the private sector and financiers. And it could be, a private investor, it could be a government running a tender, it could be a results-based financing program. Really, the idea is, can you use technology to create a very streamlined and transparent and repeatable process, so that you can start to do this again and again in different countries or for different portfolios, and provide enough transparency so that different investors have confidence in each other's financing. So you can imagine, if you've got a very streamlined, clear, dependable results-based financing scheme in a country, it makes it a lot easier for a private investor to come in and deploy capital alongside that. So we'll hear more from Rosemary soon about how UEF is doing that standardization and clarity of process is a really big piece of that, and our platform is using software to make that happen. And then maybe the hardest piece of the puzzle is kind of on the analytics side once you have an operating portfolio. At Odyssey, we truly believe the best way to be able to push forward more and more capital at the scale of $100 million per transaction is to have a standard set of KPIs through which we can track our existing investments and understand how are these projects really performing. What did we learn from the last transaction, and can we make sure that things like ARPUs and average consumption per user and system performance the standards and benchmarks are being met? And the challenge here is that if you have 500 mini grid projects, that's many, many, many billions of data points that you're collecting every 15 minutes to answer those questions. Even what seems like a simple KPI, average revenue per user, is actually a metric that you're calculating from thousands and hundreds of thousands of transactions across hundreds of thousands of smart meters that have been installed. And so then you get into sort of a big data challenge, which is where we're spending a lot of our time right now, making sure that that's something that those questions can be answered from the data that's coming from operating systems.
Thank you, Emily. I think that big data challenge is a really interesting question, and we can come back to that. And also this kind of standardization across different elements of mini grid developers. I was particularly taken by the idea of demand forecasting and demand, having a standardized approach to that. I think is a really interesting question. I don't know if Arnaud wants to talk about that, but as a mini grid developer, maybe have a little think about that, Arnaud, while I allow you to introduce yourself and ask you the first question. I think the question for Arnaud to start with is about, where is the market? The market is concentrated maybe in a few countries. I think Arnaud's operating the DRC, a difficult country with a high access deficit. And I suppose my question to Arnaud is, what is it kind of how do you rate the challenge versus opportunity balance in working in a country like DRC? And do you introduce the project that you're, the work you're doing there as well, Arnaud, as part of the answer?
Okay, thank you, John. So obviously, challenge and opportunity is always two sides of the same coin. DRC, as you mentioned, is a challenging market. That there is not just a lack of energy, but also just a lack of general infrastructure. There's a good fit for microgrids, that whole microgrid structure, because there's no centralized grid existing. It is obviously a very large, geographically large country, and a lot of population centers that have significant needs in terms of energy. The challenges we come in the DRC has actually, I think, impacted our model. And so the model we've developed for the DRC is what we call eStreet, which I think is a bit different from your classic mini grid, in that the eStreet is it's a mini grid or microgrid powered business park. So we are actually really focused on productive use, on both commercial and industrial use for communities, rather than the residential connections, at least as a starting point. And there's another reason for this, is that in many cases there are solar home system options available, and these are existing in the DRC and available in many communities, which might be a better first step for residential users, and simpler to deploy than a whole community microgrid. Or mini grid. But where I think mini grids and microgrids have a very strong impact and potential advantage is around supporting economic activity, and especially larger loads like productive users, industrial and commercial users. What we're working on is actually really seeing the eStreet as a platform for green growth. So the eStreet we've developed is not just, again, not just an energy service. The solar battery is the heart of the system, but that on-site reliable power also allows us to provide water services, modern sanitation, telecom access, 24/7 security. And so all of this is actually what's needed for the types of clients we're serving with eStreet. And the other interesting aspect is, in these communities where there is limited energy, where there is limited infrastructure, this obviously constrains economic activity. So in many cases, what was formalized activity has been abandoned, or much of the activity is small scale and informal. But the clients we're actually serving are national or international companies that we will attract to these communities to set up operations there. And so they need not just energy, they need obviously cost-effective energy to be competitive, but they need a whole suite of services for which to operate effectively. And that's why the eStreet model is not just energy, it's an integrated approach.
Thanks, Arnaud. And what do you think about some of the comments that, some of the input that we've had from Emily and from Joao, particularly this idea of standardization Joao mentioned and Emily talked about in particular, that standardization, how do you feel about that as an entrepreneur trying to do the right thing in your organization compared to others? Just give us a couple of minutes on what you think about standardization, if that's all right, Arnaud.
Of course. I guess, of course, the more we can attract to capital and the lower cost capital, that will drive the growth in the sector. So appreciate that we are still the early stages of the mini grid and microgrid sector. And so the more we can have clear metrics and attract capital, the better it is for all of us. That being said, our approach as not just providing a kilowatt hour, which is a bit of a utility model, we have to tailor our offering to what's available in the community, to what the economic activity and economic potential of the community is. So our site in Bandaka, there's a rich fishery. So by definition, we're having to address that as a very interesting source of economic activity and local value add for that community. Each community will have their own resources and activities that have to be tailored to. So yes, I think there is some standardization, especially in terms of KPIs and raising capital. But I believe each community will have its own needs and opportunities that have to be targeted as well.
Thanks, Arnaud. And just Rosemary and Sam, my apologies. I'm just going to toss this one quickly back to Emily, just to kind of respond to what Arnaud said on maybe some of the limits on standardization, or do you see that as limitations, or how do you see that, Emily, in particular?
Yeah, I mean, certainly you can't standardize everything. And what we're always trying to do is figure out what are the parts we can standardize, and what are things that need to be tailored to the specific country context or type of project. We get into this a lot in terms of technical planning. You don't want to be too in determining if it's been sort of technically designed well and will meet the needs of the community there. But there's certainly, there's a lot of common elements across any transaction that I think, particularly how data is analyzed, that could be standardized. And if we don't standardize it, we'll just end up repeating a lot of work because different entities will be developing their own tools from scratch. And we won't be able to reliably look across projects and understand how they benchmark against each other.
Thanks, Emily. That's a super response. And yeah, I think that's exactly right. That kind of balance between, there's an important balance between standardization and innovation that we need to respect in this kind of nascent sector. And so thanks for that, Arnaud and Emily. Perhaps moving on, Rosemary, hello. Sorry it's taken me so long to get to you. My question for you is, obviously SE4All has introduced these new initiatives, really exciting initiatives, so particularly the Universal Energy Facility, and also this Be Bold campaign that launched, I think, last week or the week before. Just give us a few minutes on, kind of what SE4All is trying to achieve with both the Universal Energy Facility and then the Be Bold campaign.
Thanks, John. I'll start with the Universal Energy Facility, the UEF, which is a multi-donor results-based financing facility with a goal of delivering energy connections across Africa. It's actually a collaboration between SE4All in its capacity as the program manager and its partners, which include Shell Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, Power Africa, Good Energies, Carbon Trust, DFID, and AMDA. It was born out of the need to more or less crowd in the much needed financing to scale up and bridge the energy asset gap across Africa. Whilst there's financing available, we believe that it should be directed towards projects and initiatives in a coordinated and efficient manner. As you all know, current procurement models, which are the most commonly used right now, impose high administrative costs and are also very time consuming. While on the other hand, results-based financing has been proven to be a viable alternative to traditional procurement approaches to deliver energy connections at speed and at scale, which can be seen in the case in Nigeria in the NEP program. The UEF also aims to promote a wider paradigm shift in energy assets finance through thought leadership and advocacy on the benefits of RBF as a tool for energy assets. We've designed the program to provide RBF incentives for off-grid energy developers, starting with mini grids, and we'll be expanding to solar home systems and clean cooking. We also streamline and standardize the process, and we are using Odyssey Energy Solutions as a platform to manage the entire process, which we feel is least cost intensive model, and will actually to implement and actually free up the much needed financing to actual connections on the ground. We launched the facility in October 2020, the first wave across 2 countries, Sierra Leone and Madagascar, and across the 2 countries, we hope to deploy a little over 13,000 connections across both countries. And we also opened a 3rd country window in Benin Republic in partnership with GIZ with funding from the German government. That window will also deploy north of 7,000 connections. The ultimate goal actually for the UEF is to develop it into a $500 million financing vehicle to deploy about 2.3 connections across Africa by 2023. We hope this will also leverage the much needed financing into the sector and also move the needle in achieving energy access, which is an objective of SC for All, bringing me to the Be Bold campaign, which is another initiative that has been launched by SC for All. It's actually a global movement to drive momentum towards achieving SDG 7. It calls a call to action and calls on everyone, meaning individuals, governments, institutions, to carry out actions towards achieving SDG 7. We have developed a platform where we highlight actions being taken by everyone and also show people actions they could also take towards achieving sustainable energy for all by 2030. Back to you, John.
Thank you, Rosemary. I just wonder if Joao wants to reflect on Universal Electrification Energy Facility, given the some of the finance vehicles the Africa Development Bank has, for example. Just give us some of your reflections, Joao, on the need, I think, for multiple activities in this space.
Yeah, sure. Well, the needs are immense, so I don't think anyone can claim to be able to address the problem solo. I think it's good to have some diversity. It's good to have some competition, although I think it's not even a case of competition. I think it's just really complementarity. I think the offering of the UEF is a bit different from what we are proposed to do in terms of RBF at the African Development Bank. So we want to offer RBF as part of a staple financing package, which also includes a concessional debt, commercial debt, potentially as well guarantees. So it's part of a sort of a package adapted and tailored to a specific country or a specific program. And I think that's the main difference with UEF. So in a way, I think if UEF can sort of move ahead of us and start getting capital out, start testing the approach, tweaking the approach, because we're also at that stage. We're also trying to sort of adjust the instrument to what the actual needs of the market, and each case is different, right? So we're on a steep learning curve. I'm sure UEF is on a steep learning curve, and I think we need to sort of at some point compare notes and see what lessons we can sort of share amongst ourselves and keep going at it. I think my last point around RBF is also that I don't think this is entirely a cause for the donors, right? So we're looking at this from a donor perspective, raising donor capital, trying to plug these viability gaps. But again, given the large needs, we need to also sensitize governments to come alongside us and channel some of their sort of subsidies
Yeah.
to the energy sector more generally into this specific cause, which is energy access and mini grids, or at least not sort of be too distortive towards, say, fossil fuels or large infrastructure. So that's, we're also trying to use our RBF to bring the government counterparts to the table and have this discussion about how they go about subsidizing, their power sector or their infrastructure sector more generally.
Yeah. And Jan earlier today gave what sounded like a really positive kind of account of how that was going. So that's super exciting to hear. Sam, I'm going to apologize to you as well for coming to you so late. Sam, you do one of the things that I think is super important in this area is, for mini grids in particular, is that kind of data and analytics and really understanding how we can use data to help make the leap and make the scale up and make it in an efficient way. You do a lot of work in that area, Sam. Perhaps you could describe a little bit of the work you do, and then talk about what you think we need to do going forward in terms of having the right data to be able to feed into some of these processes that will then help attract the finance. So, Sam, you're very welcome. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Yes, I think it's a good point to remember is that our sector is an unusually data-rich sector. There are huge volumes of data streaming off these sites constantly, whether that's from individual customers all the way through to the technology. And so we see that as presenting huge opportunity and a lot of untapped potential. And a lot of the innovations that we're seeing in the space are based on that. So you can map them quite clearly across the whole development cycle. So you have new data technologies that are used to find sites and build a pipeline. So everything from Nithio to our own village data analytics that uses geospatial data and machine learning. So building and assessing sites remotely saves a huge number of costs, but all the way through to what Emily was talking about digitizing things like the tendering process, and then actually on the operationalizing of a site. So of course, smart meters were a foundational digital technology that unlocked the mini-grid business model, but it's happening more and more with companies like New Sun Road, Ferntech, AMP, who are taking the huge streams of equipment level data to try and preempt problems with equipment or squeeze out more efficiency from generation or storage equipment. So there's a lot of fat to be trimmed operationally, and digital technologies are helping hugely with that. But also when it comes to the later stages, so there's some interesting stuff around refinancing or de-risking the sector using data, because of course you can look at mini grids all the way down to the level of individual connections. So everything from building crude credit profiles for individual customers all the way through to using data and standardized reporting methodologies to aggregate sites using data across multiple developers and multiple sites. And obviously that data back standardized, and if it's is a huge potential for this aggregation question that we've been talking a lot about today. We see data as being a fundamental enabling technology for that. So you see data and innovations in data up and down the mini grid supply chain.
Yeah, thank you, Sam. And it's really interesting to hear. Do you think there's a breakthrough in the future, or something that's gonna what do you think might happen in terms of the data and analytical side? You talked about machine learning a minute ago. If people talk about AI, all these kinds of things, what's coming down the pipeline? Do you think, Sam?
So I think the pattern that we've seen and the trends that we've seen has been about digital technologies removing some of the big bottlenecks and some of the big barriers.
Yeah.
So we've seen that, I mentioned with smart meters unlocking the ability to monetize these remote assets. That was a huge barrier being removed, which made a huge difference. But you're starting to see that applied in other parts of the the process. And I think the biggest innovations are going to come from the financing aspect. Again, there's a huge amount of fat to trim there, in the sense that most of the developers we talk to spend an inordinate amount of time and effort trying to get deals done, to get, for example, construction finance. Aligning the constellation of contracts and transactions and such like is a hugely demanding process. So using data to do that, for example, by aggregating mini-grid connections, high-yield mini-grid connections, and potentially using that as collateral to create something like a drawdown construction fund becomes very possible when you have the data history and machine learning algorithms looking at the risk of certain developers, the potential upside of certain sites. And as I say, if you can have an easy access, low interest drawdown construction fund, that's going to hugely reduce the costs of developing a mini grid, just because everything will happen a lot faster.
Thank you. Thank you, Sam. Thank you. That's really terrific. I'm just gonna change it up now. So I'm gonna move to the poll results, which I don't think our panelists can see. So I'm gonna read them out for everyone. So, and then hopefully I'm gonna get a reaction from the panel. So please, you can put your hands up should you want to react. So the question we asked the audience was, and then audience, by the way, we will move on to questions straight after this. So please put them in the chat and we'll get to them. So the question was, in 2025, what do you still expect to be the challenge of scaling mini grids? And so a nice future question. And the audience had 5 options. And so the first one was, is it going to be an attractive investment opportunity? Second was, is it going to have a stable and supportive regulatory regime? The third was the cost of energy for mini grids. The fourth was average revenue per user, ARPU, which Emily was talking about, and then the last one was a viable business model. And so, in order of vote, so 30%, the biggest vote was a viable business model. Thought that would still be the main barrier. Then after that, 28% a stable and supportive regulatory regime. And after that, 24% average revenue per user. And then both at 9% was, is it an attractive investment opportunity, or is the cost of energy going to be low enough? That was the result of our poll. I don't know if one of our panelists would like to put their hands up and respond to that that poll from the audience. So repeating it again, the biggest barriers would be a viable business model and stable and supportive regulatory regime and average revenue per user were the 3 barriers that the audience thought would still exist in 2025. Hi, Sam, go for it. Thank you.
Hi. So I'd say if I was betting on those, I'd say the regulatory side would probably be the barrier that still exists going forwards. That's often the toughest nut to crack. But I think what's really interesting is that a lot of the challenges that you suggested come down to a very interesting point that the mini grid sector has, in the sense that I think it's trying to do several things at the same time. Universal electrification, or electrifying a rural population, has never historically been a profit-making exercise, but we're trying to do it with quite commercial mechanisms. And so I think that disaggregating the question of electrification into those which are not necessarily going to be profitably electrified, and perhaps they need to be subsidized, and those that actually can be really profitably electrified, for example, all the productive users, and separating out those 2 different models, I think is going to make a huge difference in creating targeted, specific financing mechanisms for those different segments. So I think that touches on the question of ARPU, it touches on the question of costs, and it touches on the question of business models. I think we better articulate who is electrified and how, and innovate around that, rather than smushing it all together.
Thank you, Sam. Other comments from the panel? Anyone else have a crack at this? Otherwise, we can move on to some of the audience questions. I mean, I think my reflections on that response are. It's really interesting that I think, and that mini grids, will the audience thinks mini grids will be an attractive investment opportunity in the future. Only 9% thought that would be a barrier in 2025. So I find that really encouraging in terms of this survey. You could argue that that's counter to the average revenue per user model, but at the same time, I think that's a super encouraging a result from the panel. So sorry, from the audience. So I'm going to move on quickly. Let's take some audience questions. And so again, I'll open this panel. So one is around accelerating momentum. So what do the panel think is needed in the next 6 months to steer culture from an arguable current financial scale bias, not enough political will, towards pragmatic progress for these communities that need energy wealth creation now? So kind of, I suppose the question is, in the next 6 months, how can this community help influence the wider, particularly governments? I think this question is towards, of making sure that mini grids are part of their electrification programs, that they're on the map, as it were, and that we can have pragmatic progress. That mini grids allow quick connections, for example. What can be done to kind of embed that in different government environments? I suppose I'm going to ask João to take that one first, given his experience of working very closely with African governments, and maybe afterwards I could ask Rosemary what she thinks, for example.
Yes, it's not an easy question and doesn't have an easy answer. I think primarily because it touches on, as Sam articulated earlier, it touches on multiple competing priorities, and then it touches on political processes and certain sort of views of the world. And you would probably have countries that would say, yes, we're all for mini grids, but as long as they come and deliver power at our national tariff, or as long as it's sort of a majority owned by the public sector, or so you have these sort of idiosyncrasies that sometimes get on the way of the best possible business models and the best possible regulatory frameworks. I think from our perspective is that we've already had, we have, I think, good sort of 10 years of discussions with national authorities around opening up to private sector in the utility scale space. And we've seen a surge of IPPs over the years. We've seen the unbundling of the sector. We've seen more private sector friendly enabling environments. We're really sort of coming in on the tail of that and pushing the discussion forward and really saying, well, there are still some pieces missing in terms of enabling more private sector, enabling more private capital, enabling more innovation. As you've seen on the utility scale, I think there is a room here for us to sort of also transition to a more private sector model in mini grids, and when we can show that that some of these business models really can deliver a lot of impact on the ground, and we're seeing still a lot of poverty, a lot of populations being left behind, a lot of civil strife around it, a lot of political unrest, and no government wants to sort of see these sort of swathes of population being left behind in poverty without jobs. So they're very keen to hear, they're very keen to explore, and to the extent that they see that, enabling a little bit more private sector, maybe being a little bit more flexible on tariff regimes, maybe also allocating some level of subsidy to some of these business models, you can really, catalyze more activity in agriculture, in agribusiness, in sort of light manufacturing industries and in rural settings. So there is an intrinsic value and intrinsic benefit that can be harnessed and harvested if governments play it the right way. So that's how we tend to approach it.
Yeah, thank you, Joao. And it's a super tough question, isn't it, to kind of get your head around. I wonder if I could bring Rosemary in. Kind of one of the things I think SE4All has been trying to do is engage, African governments more than perhaps they had done in the past. And so that kind of question around political will, where do you see that, Rosemary, in terms of what you've been doing with Universal Electrification Facility and other initiatives that the SE4All is trying to achieve?
Thanks, John. Like Zhao said, it's not an easy road to climb because you need to do a lot of, I think from our perspective, it needs a lot of consultation. It needs a lot of, you need to prove that the inherent benefits of investing and providing incentives to allow the private sector grow in the off-grid space. From the SE4All, we sometimes have to go into a country with a suite of activities. We have the policy and regulatory framework team, which works directly with government to try to sensitize and help build out a proper, a robust mini-grid or off-grid regulatory framework for countries. We also have the IEP, which is Integrated Energy Planning, which helps countries to develop a robust integrated energy plan to help show them the least cost way to electrify the country. And with the impact of COVID, we've also developed the Recover Better plan, which also helps countries to think inwardly, because with the limited financing for anything these days, they need to develop, we are trying to get them to look at developing and recovering better with renewable energy. From our experience in Nigeria, where I worked with the REA, it was more or less the same thing. We had to do a lot of data collection, because with data, you can actually prove and say, okay, with this is what you get. So data is also integral to making the case for governments to have that shift and look towards an off-grid space and look at mini-grids as a tool to electrify the unelectrified people. I know like government is government, will always try to protect the citizens and ensure tariffs are low, but if you can prove that with data that this is the least cost way, this will trigger economic development, trigger business activities. Yeah, that's the only way that can work out.
Thank you, Rosemary. If anyone else wants to respond to that, please put your hand up and we'll zoom you in. Emily, please. Thank you.
Yeah, and just really quick, I hope this doesn't morph the question too much, but the thing I love about this question is that we're talking about the next 6 months. I think, often in this sector, we think on really long time horizons and talk about, our wish for the future of this sector, but we don't have a lot of time to electrify the large swaths of the world that don't have access to power. And so if I had a wish for what if I could say, here's where I want to be in 6 months, I want to see the financing mechanisms that are launched delivering connections and really showing, being proof points for the rest of the world on how this can be done. So let's see Nigeria NEP program delivering mini grid connections. Let's see UEF delivering mini grid connections. Let's see the IFC deploying capital through scaling microgrids. Because I think one of the biggest changes or sort of motivators that we've seen in this sector to get other countries, other programs starting to kind of move in this trajectory is seeing results. And I think we're finally at a place in the next 6 months we can really see results on the ground from some of these big initiatives that have been launched.
Thank you, Emily. That's a really great perspective, and thank you for the question. Next question I'm going to ask, I think I'm going to start with Arno to try and give some perspective on it. Again, it's kind of an enigmatic question. So the question is, how do you go deep, crowd in more local actors, scale local learning, educators, including on-project technical/finance competencies and language? What's your experience of those things when you've been working in DRC, Arno, in terms of, as this question describes, going deep?
Right. So a couple of points from our experience, as mentioned in DRC. Our model has actually been to work closely with local partners. So our DRC work is a joint venture with a Congolese entrepreneur. So we are working extremely closely with people from these markets, which I think is required in order to navigate successfully lots of the issues. And we talked about the complexities of operating in a market like the DRC. So I think that's the first point is we want to support and work with local partners that come from the sector, the energy sector, or the energy access sectors in these markets. But even more, I think we're focused on how we from the start engage and build up competencies in the sites. And I think that also ties to our model. So as mentioned, the eStreet model is focused on commercial, productive use, industrial activity. A couple of things there. Most of what we're targeting does not exist in these communities right now because of the lack and cost and unreliability of energy, which is primarily diesel based. And so with these types of clients of ours, we actually have to co-create with them because the equipment they select to operate impacts us. It impacts our cost to serve. It impacts how we serve our other clients as well as our viability. And obviously, if we can't reliably deliver our power or deliver it at the cost point that they need, their business doesn't work. So it's actually a very close co-creation and co-construction of businesses on our eStreet sites. So from inherently, we have to work extremely closely with those people. The other aspect I think that's important for our model is to aggregate and centralize these activities. And this allows us to have scale that allows us to have a permanent team that will operate, that will do the maintenance, the security, all this. And so our base case is to have teams of 25 to 30 people that are permanently on site. And that allows us to have the reliability and the quality required for these systems to be successful.
Thanks, Hanno. And that sounds like a really exciting model that is innovative. One more quick question that we've got, and then I'm going to wrap up and we're going to move to just some closing remarks from each of the panelists. As mini-grids gets larger and larger, is there a risk of leaving an access gap between SHS and National Grid spec grid? So I suppose the question is, is there in the panelists' mind, a differentiate as the mini-grid sector scales? Are we leaving behind people with solar home systems? I don't know who wants to take that one first. Maybe I'm thinking maybe Joao or Rosemary might like to comment, or Sam on that question. Put your hand up. Who wants to take it? Bearing in mind, Joao, I can't see you at the moment. So, Sam, thank you for stepping in.
Yeah, thanks, John. So I'll just two small points, and I think it's a really interesting question, but just to kind of paint a bit of a context around that question, I think one of the things that's often forgotten is the utility of that and a solar home system or a grid extension connection is that often the utility that's been perceived at that end point of use is not really considered. So perhaps in some scenarios, solar home systems are an ideal solution for someone who has relatively minor needs, whether it's offsetting kerosene in lamps and such like. And so I think that there should always be a space for meeting the needs, the sort of the low demanding needs. I think that's really important to mention. But when you're looking at something as crucial as rural industrialization and rural development, you do need a minimum threshold of power to be able to provide productive use levels of power for people to be able to actually start having some first level industry. And that seems to be a fundamental catalyst. And so I think it's depending on what you're trying to achieve, there is space for the whole panoply of options. But I think if you're looking to develop rural areas, it does need to be above a certain tier of service.
Thank you, Sam. Rosemary, did I see your hand up? Quick, do you want to respond to that, or should we just move on to the closing session? Not seeing your hand now. Okay, fine. So thank you, everyone. What we want to do is close with is just give everyone a kind of minute or so to say, kind of what's the primary thing they think that needs to happen to scale the sector. What is it? What's the kind of key element? I want to start myself by giving a bit of a view from me, which is on cost of energy. So I think cost of energy needs to come down quite significantly in order to scale the sector. It reduces the demand on subsidy and those types of things significantly. So innovation that can bring down the cost of energy will repay itself multiple times over in reduced subsidies for connections. And so that innovation can come in technology or business models, but it's a real strong investment in order to bring down the cost of energy and therefore bring savings to subsidy budgets. Then means we can reach more people. Would be my view. I'm going to ask Joao now what his kind of 1 minute, kind of the key thing on making the sector scale is. Thank you, Joao. We can't hear you, Joao. We still can't hear you. Joao, perhaps I'll come back to you, and then you can fix your sound. Emily, what's your view?
Yeah, I have to give two. One's more of a plea and one is a dream.
Okay.
The plea is donor coordination. I think we're hearing more donors are all sort of thinking along the same lines, particularly when we talk about, financing scheme like results-based financing. And I'm really looking forward to seeing donors starting to, put money into the same facility and join forces rather than kind of create their own each time and recreate the wheel a bit. So that's the plea. And then the dream is more standardized, structured project finance. Cross-Boundary Energy Access released a white paper a few months ago, open sourcing their mini-grid asset fund, which was just incredible because it painted this view of what would the mini-grid sector look like if we finance these like we do bridges or ports. And that report for me just sort of painted this picture of where the sector could go if we had the right type of financing going into it.
Super, thank you, Emily. I'm gonna move on to Arnaud. I will come back to you, Joao. Don't worry. I'm gonna move on to Arnaud on what's his view.
Thanks, John. So I would agree with the audience's poll result and say that the business model is really core for us to really grow and accelerate the growth in the sector. I think the business model is tied into all these: access to finance, the cost of energy to the users. There's a very close link in terms of the impact we'll have in terms of jobs, green growth, economic growth. You need to have proper business models to bring down this cost to serve, to bring down the cost so that these communities have opportunities for economic growth. And so, yeah, and that will help us attract more capital and keep the sector growing healthily.
Thank you, Arnaud. That's great, super stuff. And then I'm going to turn to Rosemary.
Hi, John. For me, I think I have two dreams and a point to make. One, a paradigm shift to results-based financing because it's scalable and it's a model that shifts the risk from the government and donors to the private sector. And it also provides greater regulatory certainty to the industry about financial support, and also aggregates financing and scales support across multiple countries, which traditional government procurement methods such as tenders cannot do and not easily scalable. Another point I wanted to make was on subsidies, which I think should be clear, modeled simply and clearly, taking account viability gaps in assumptions that are realistic, so that it covers the difference between the fully cost-reflective tariff and it's affordable for users. And a third point, which ties into the points John made, is economies of scale. I think from our experience at SE4All, especially during the pandemic, at some point, no one could find panels or batteries on the continent. I think governments and investors looking towards maybe like an assembly plant on the continent or actually manufacturing plants will actually help the cost of production, because I feel like at this stage, we think everyone who is developing the project is more or less importing. And I think that also adds the cost of production. Back to you, John.
Thank you, Rosemary. And then very quickly, we're going to do Sam and Joao. Bear in mind, we have exactly 2 minutes left. So no more than a minute. Sam, you go first, then Joao.
Sure. So I would say, as I mentioned earlier, I think the biggest barriers are in the financing space. So I would say that's often that's a result of the mismatch between, very small projects and financiers who need to have the, due diligence costs and such like. So I think that data is going to underpin all of this. And because we've got data at the granular connection level, why are we not re-aggregating them according to connection types and start building portfolios that perhaps are suitable for different types of standardized subsidy or different types of commercial business model, and actually aggregate back using the data into suitable financing mechanisms. So I'd say the big gains are going to be in the financial innovation.
Thank you, Sam. Joao, you're going to close us up. Hope you're back online and we can hear you. You can hear me. Looks like Joao's struggling a little bit. So, you there? Sounds like he's tackling some dogs. I guess we're going to have to wrap it up there, everyone. Thank you very much. So sorry, Joao, that we couldn't include you in that last part of the panel. You've been a great contribution. Thank you very much to all our panels, and we're going to go back to the main room shortly, I believe. So thank you very much.
Thank you.